much. Thank you, Jim, for the invite and for tracking me down, and for all of you welcoming me here tonight, and in fact my daughter and husband who are here in the room. And I have to say, we're not experts on San Luis Obispo, but in the short time that we've spent, you know, it's like, does it need to get better? It seems pretty darn good. And in terms of hearing from what's going on sort of outside in other places, good ideas from other places, you know, I've spent, you can tell from my accent that I didn't grow up in LA, but I'm definitely now a full-on Angelino. I've lived there for 32 years, and it's extremely big. It's extremely big, and it has some what are called sort of wicked problems, you know, when it comes to figuring out how to evolve into the 21st century and deal with a real shift in development patterns that have to happen if people are going to continue to be able to live there. But anyway, yes, thank you so much for the very generous introduction. Yes, my name's Frances Anderton. I grew up in the UK. I've already told a few people in the room that I wanted to come to America from childhood. I just loved loud, enthusiastic Americans. I wanted to be part of that world. And I went to architecture school, and then I went to work for an architecture magazine. And then pretty much my first assignment was I was sent to Los Angeles. I was sent to LA to see the cool new stuff that was coming out of LA. But this was in the late 80s. At which point I did meet Gary and, you know, some of the other the people who are now the kind of establishment, but back then they were still the experimental cutting-edge architects. But anyway, and then I moved to LA, and then I stayed very much in architecture and design reporting until we had, and this is all a point. I'm telling you all this because it sort of leads into where I'm going tonight. So probably that any of you that's you know, old enough will remember that LA was sort of rent asunder by the civil unrest back in 1992. It was a huge event that exposed all sorts of fault lines in Los Angeles beyond just the earthquake ones, and having to do with economic inequity and land use challenges and all sorts of things. And that actually led to a current affairs program being created to sort of address what was going on in LA, called Which Way LA, and I found my way to that program, which has then led me to be, since then, consistently interested in what happens at the intersection between architecture design, which I love and am passionate about, but and policy and competing needs and competing stakeholder interests. And right now, all of that is absolutely reached a kind of moment of great friction in Los Angeles around the issue of housing. I know I'm looking forward to hearing from you about what you're dealing with, confronting in San Luis Obispo, but in LA, I'm sure you're probably many of you very, very familiar with LA, and it is having a huge challenge right now. It is seeing an exodus of young families. You know, if you don't have young families in a place, do you have a future? It is, the rent is, you know, there's something like a third to a half of Angelinos are rent burdened to the point of spending either a third or even a half of their incomes on their rent. The RENA numbers have come out, you know, this housing element, you probably have the housing element. Well, the RENA numbers are calling for LA to produce something like 450,000 housing units. And there's a tremendous amount of resistance to that housing. And there's really, honestly, it's like this kind of civil, you know, I don't want to use the WAR word, but there is tremendous friction between those that would rather LA hews to its 20th century model of planning, very low rise and car-based and kind of easy living. People would like to bring back diagonal parking if they possibly could. And now we're in 21st century LA, which is trying to accommodate people that cannot be shoehorned into that model. So we now have sort of competing models of how to live in LA. We're building a mass transit system. There's all sorts of policy measures to push more density close to the transit stations and on the thoroughfares. But even that is complicated. Even that can be a great big struggle. So people I know who are in development or in architecture will literally spend, literally 10 years waiting to get a permit for 30 units, 30 dwellings to be built. And so we'll talk about it a bit later, but there are efforts to sort of speed things up, expedite, but that brings up new questions. What happens when we sort of suddenly expedite a whole bunch of, I was telling Jim about this, a directive that came down from our mayor, or LA's mayor, we're 88 cities in the LA County, LA's mayor Karen Bass, who came up with a directive to try and stimulate the much faster streamlining of the processing of buildings. And it could lead to really quite tall, multi-story buildings going on the thoroughfares, maybe with very small units in them. What kind of lives are going to be lived in those places? How much do those sort of fulfill the California dream? So with that I will lead into talking a bit about the book I wrote. So yes, here I am, me, Frances Anderton, holding up the book, which was published in 2022. Fortuitously, I happened to be carrying that book going around LA with a bunch of students from Harvard who were visiting, which just shows people over there on the East Coast, they're talking about LA's housing problems. It's like everybody wants to talk about LA's housing problems. So there I was with helping show some students around, and we just happened to be in front of a rather large apartment building that is not in the book, but that's the new LA. So anyway, why write a book on multifamily housing? So, like I said, there's a lot of tension in LA right now surrounding development and density patterns and so on. And this really started to come to a head in 2016 when two ballot measures went on. They were both anti-density ballot measures. One was in Santa Monica, where I live, and one is in LA, next to me. And the passion and rage that were kind of became evident in those ballot measures woke me up to the fact that this was the pressing issue of our time, that there was a strong politicians were making the argument that LA had to get denser, we had to have more multi-story, we had to have more multifamily, and yet it wasn't gaining purchase as something that people were enthusiastic about. And I was hearing that even advocates for this kind of forgoing denser oftentimes didn't themselves live that lifestyle themselves, and so couldn't fully persuade Angelenos to get behind multi-story buildings on Pico or Lincoln or wherever it might be, because it just wasn't a lifestyle that was aspirational. So it was being sold as a kind of a solution to a problem to solve some people over there that would live in these places. But you weren't hearing straight from the mouths of the advocates a case for why anyone would want this new LA. And it so happened that I myself, as Jim has already set me up for this, I have been living for 32 years in a very unconventional version of the LA dream, which is, yes, I've been living in an apartment in a building designed by Gary way before he became the famous Gary. And it's a 6-unit apartment. You'll see some pics in a minute. And I'm going to now embarrass my daughter, who is in this room. But myself, my husband, and my daughter she came up in that building, and she went off to high school, Samo High to be precise, and discovered that all her friends all lived the conventional, the dream existence, the big single-family house, north of Wilshire, north of Montana. And Summer, are you there, Summer? Oh, there you are. Do you mind me saying the truth? Which is how much Summer was mortified that we lived in an apartment and became like really cross with us, her parents, like what failures we were, that we hadn't somehow secured the proper way of living. But as I told her, and I will show you momentarily, the place that we lived actually enabled a very, very nice lifestyle. It didn't enable, it didn't build equity, it didn't, create intergenerational wealth, it didn't do all sorts of things that homes do, but it did other things, and we're going to talk about what the other things are. So anyway, I set out to write a book that would really give a different history of LA. Because LA actually is absolutely full of multifamily dwellings, apartment buildings. It in fact numerically has more multifamily and apartment buildings, connected buildings, than it does single family, but you just wouldn't know it because it's not the story that is told. It's not the story that's told in movies, in advertising. It's the kind of hidden history of LA, and the numbers can tell you that LA has had repeated booms, and every time there's been a boom, there have been a lot of apartment buildings have gone up, and yet the R1 or the single family zones take up far more space. 2/3 of LA's residential land, single family, that's the image that has been projected around the world. But the reality is that even in Santa Monica, if you think Santa Monica, you probably think affluent Santa Monica. But Santa Monica is something like 72% renters in apartments. West Hollywood, 78% renters in apartments. There's a lot of misconceptions about how Angelenos really live, and it dates back to the founding of LA, or at least the founding by the Yankees and the Spanish. Since that time, really starting in the late 19th century, boosters of the region started peddling the idea that LA was a place to come and sort of get the castle of your own, and the Realtors Association, the whole realty industry flourished in LA. It's sort of that's kind of its mother's milk, as the realty industry, and very quickly they started having some do's and don'ts. And one of the don'ts was if you are in the realty business, you cannot refer to an apartment as a home. You can only refer to a house as a home. So it was just sort of part of the messaging that became really entrenched in people's understanding of the dream. So anyway, here we are very quickly. As Jim said, the building I live in does not look like a Gary. It's a very early Gary, but Gary actually himself lived in this building, as did his shrink. And his shrink, we live in the apartment that was actually the apartment that Gary's shrink lived in for a while, and Gary lived upstairs from the shrink, which is a very unusual relationship to have with your shrink. But anyway, he built the building in 1962, built it as a spec development, 6 units, and this is our living room. We like colour. But this is what you really have to stare at. You have to stare at the plan, because it's the plan that matters. This building is not one of the darling courtyard housing developments that I will get to in a minute. This was from 1962, by which time there was tremendous pressure on cars. Cars had to take precedence. There had to be parking space under the building. So this building was arranged to make sure every unit had its own space for the car, the spaces at the back, and then it was arranged around a courtyard. And it's just a little courtyard. Oh, that's bonus image, which is not in the book. That is Frank Gehry's mother, because Frank Gehry's sister lived in the building as well at a certain point. So Mother Gehry spent quite a bit of time there. But anyway, it's all arranged around a courtyard. And then I'll just jump ahead to here. And there is the courtyard with me and my neighbour. I took the photo. My neighbours, it's not a lovely, elegant courtyard. I've already gone around with Jim around San Luis Obispo, and I've already seen better courtyards than this one. But nonetheless, what this building has provided that I tried to make my daughter understand, and she appreciates it now, was that just this fact of funneling all of us through this central space with these external staircases inherently created a sense of community. So even though we don't party like this is actually faked, we do not party like this on a daily basis, but nonetheless, we bump into each other all the time, and we, in that very kind of organic, sort of easy way, and we all know each other, and we all, look after each other's pets or water their plants or do those basic things that are the little stitches in the tapestry of a community. So anyway, I show you it because the title of the book, I decided I wanted to reposition the multifamily, but then I wanted to focus on a particular type of multifamily. I didn't want to do a book about tenements. LA has a lot of tenements, but that wasn't going to be the book. The book was going to be specifically about a legacy of housing that LA has that is counter. It really offers a counter model to the single family home, which obviously emphasizes independence and some level of intended self-isolation. Sort of that's the point. The point is independence. And who can argue with that? It has many desirable attributes. But there's also other ways of living that are also desirable. And in LA, there happens to be this incredible legacy of housing, dwellings that are arranged around a common space. And our place where we live is just part of that tradition. And I was just so struck over the years that I've lived in that apartment, like, why did I never want to leave? You know, because it's not, you just saw it, it's not picture perfect by any stretch, but it is so comfortable. There are other attributes which will just underscore, make our place very lovely to live in, which is really key to the success or failure of multifamily, which is it happens to be designed in such a way that you get natural light from several sides. So we're in an apartment that has natural light coming in from 3 sides, which is quite unusual, and it does make it a very, really lovely, like a house actually. There's so much access to light. So there's a very, very nice quality. But anyway, so the book Common Ground, and I just wanted to showcase this history that we have in LA of these buildings that do this. And developers that have built these kinds of buildings didn't do them out of the kindness of their heart. And they didn't even do them because we've got a theory about we want to create these places where people will feel some sense of conviviality. No, these were expedient in lots of ways. They took a lot that you could have one house on, and they said, we'll have 10. We'll have 10, and we'll have a little green in the middle, and we'll make them feel like little cottages, but they'll be 400 square feet rather than 2,000 square feet. And back then, there's plenty of room for parking. So if people are even driving, so people, and because these places were often then served by the red car, and these places just took off. They took off. They were so popular. This is a bungalow court, very early bungalow court from about 1916, and of course we should say they were playing to what makes California so lovely, which is you've got this wonderful weather. Why have a New York or Chicago style tenement building when you can actually open up to the sunlight, and you can bring in cross ventilation through both sides through having this central court? So there was an environmental reason as well. And these places were just took off. There were hundreds, thousands of them were built. And I don't think I'm the only one to think this. I think it was because LA is full of people that came from somewhere else, and they left their families behind. I did the same. They left their old friends behind, and they come to LA, and it's this great big vast place. They're trying to make it in the film industry or whatever, and they're looking for a place to live, and they find themselves in this little bungalow court, and they've suddenly know 10 people who become their little community. And I know this to be true because the LA Times actually published a poem in the early 20s that was kind of a celebration of the sociability of these places. So anyway, I just set out to just tell that story. This is, if any of you follows kind of early modernist architecture in LA, the Schindler House, which is duplex. It was one of the earliest modernist duplexes, and this is centered around the sort of S-shaped building is actually centered around 2 courtyards, and the courtyards were used a lot. They had a very kind of bohemian sort of lifestyle going there. And this is Thanksgiving, 1931, at the Schindler House. And then different time periods, the era of Googie, what Alan Hess has called Googie architecture. This is West Hollywood. This is where you get the swimming pool. The single family homes in the valley have the swimming pools. Well, so do the multifamily. They have them, but they get rid of the grass, and in goes the swimming pool, and the tiki fixtures and the ferns, and it was a different style, but it was a similar kind of lifestyle. And then now today we now are going higher, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. So people don't necessarily get funneled through a courtyard. They more likely have now gather on the roof. It has to be a bit more intentional, but the roof has become a place of community. And this is a new multifamily building that went up in Santa Monica market rate, around 300 units, no, 350 I think. and the architect managed to get little courtyards at all sorts of different levels and terraces. And this couple, who in the picture just happen to be kind of instigators of fun, so the place, they've really, you know, you can design a space, but it won't always be filled just how you imagine it should be. It sometimes takes the people to make the place work, and in this particular case there's a very energetic sort of social life going on thanks to this couple. But yeah, the roof, now the 5th elevation is where the stuff's happening. So anyway, and then back to the old days, Bowen Court, this is in Pasadena, and this is 2 women I met in the writing of the book who had moved in. I think their children had grown up, they moved in and they've become friends. And they've lived there now for many, many years. And when I met them, it was just at the tail end of the pandemic. And they said, to be honest, we actually don't really feel the impacts of the pandemic. Admittedly, they did not have to go to the office, but because they both were working at home. But this bungalow court provided the distance and the company and the fresh air, and so it just sort of showed that on multiple levels this kind of living could be so lovely. So anyway, in the book I just go through different typologies, different types of these kinds of housing. They kind of change more or less with every decade, and showed examples of them. How am I doing for time, Andy?
Yeah.
Do I have 15? Okay. So bungalow courts, like I said, they appear in about the teens of the last century, and they just race across Los Angeles. They're in all neighborhoods of Los Angeles. And the first one is, or rather one of the first ones that is still extant, is called Bowen Court, and it's really quite a grand one, and that's where the 2 ladies were that I just showed you. So there, can you see the palm tree on the left? And then look here, there it is, same palm tree. But it's really, this is incredible, this place, because this is like a garden. This is cottages in the garden. Some of them have more landscaping than others, but this one was rich in gardening, by Arthur and Alfred Heinemann, who actually created the first motel, I think, near here. Yes, that's right. Could have done a whole thing on the motels. I sort of didn't spend time with that because anyway, and then into the 30s, and of course in LA there's a great obviously we all know it has Hollywood, and the Hollywood, you have all these fantasy permeating as fantasy permeates the single family, so it does the multifamily, and this goes up in the 30s, and it's really like sort of Tunisia, Morocco, a little bit of Greece, you know, all sort of, and it's this wonderful, all these alleys. I'll show you another picture in a minute. Absolutely gorgeous. And then you get a bit later, not a bit later, actually a bit earlier. I'm sorry, I've suddenly got jumped back in time. The early modernists, they also they see that the courtyard is a really great way to sort of organise homes. And Irving Gill, if any of you follows architecture, Irving Gill actually builds this out in Sierra Madre, and it's worker housing. They're talking about building worker housing way before we're having a conversation now about affordable housing. But this place is so popular that, as happens with places that are so well designed and people really want to live there, then of course the rents go up. Mm-hmm. So it ceases to be worker housing. But anyway, and that's still there today. Another one by Irving Gill in our city, Santa Monica. This is in perfect condition. It's become a condo, and now the condos are selling for something like the last one was 2.15 million for 1,100 square feet. 1,100. Pardon?
Very minimum.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then you also, as I say, fantasy prevails. People love the Mediterranean. I don't need to tell you, it's all up the coast. So. And then Renaissance influence as well, where you get the more hardscape in combination with water features and landscaping, and then more back to the modernists. Rudolf Schindler, who is famous for his single family houses, but really was so experimental with multifamily. This is incredible. This is 16 units. Is this right? It was 16 units built over 13 years, or 13 units built over 16 years, but whatever it was, every unit is different, which of course you don't usually get in an apartment building. That is the biggest challenge for the designer, is take an inherently standardized unit and then make it interesting. So this one's a bit of an outlier in he had the freedom. It's the same client, did the whole thing. Herman Sachs was a ceramicist, and fantastic place. This is one of the rooms. Like I said, apartments only work if you have great light. This one has stunning light. Stunning is a stunning space. Richard Neutra, if any of you follows modernism, Strathmore Apartments in Westwood looked rather barren when they were first built. International style, very naked kind of hills. Nobody wanted to live there at first, but finally Orson Welles lived there. Famous silent movie star whose name is momentarily leaving me. The Eameses lived there, absolutely loved it, and this is it now. Became a jungle. Because Neutra believed, and this is germane to this whole notion of the multifamily that works, he believed you had to give as much of the land over to landscape, if not more, if you could possibly do it. That living in close proximity to each other was only bearable, especially in LA, if you had the open land experience. So bit of in just more curious design. John Lautner, who is again super famous for his single family houses, one of which is called the Sheets Goldstein residence. This is the Sheets apartments, same client, but you hardly ever hear about this. You hear about Sheets Goldstein. These are the most extraordinary apartments. They're in a terrible state because they're in Westwood Village and they're on Frat House Row. So the person who owns it cannot rent to anybody but frat house students. And so unfortunately the place is not in great condition. But when you can sneak in, you're amazed. And that too, he managed to take 8 units and make everyone different. Zsa Zsa Gabor lived there. And then I jumped past the previous one because it was a bit of a sidebar into the sort of motel story. I'll just leave that for now. And then here's a bungalow court. I said, these bungalow courts are everywhere. This is in our neighbourhood, actually, just around the corner from where we live. It was so run down to the point they were going to pull it down. The city stepped in and begged the owner to save it, and they actually restored it, did it all up, and then changed the landscaping. So you now have today's kind of natives and olives and lavender, and you can see it's sort of taken on a whole new life. But now this 400 square feet unit's so desirable, 2,300 a month. So these places don't necessarily solve the housing problem, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So anyway, then garden apartments, part of LA's history. It's had a very fraught history. It had housing policies that were very racially segregationist, as we know, and it also, at the same time as those policies were in place, and restrictive covenants and restrictive zoning and so on, there also was a massive influx of people into LA during the Dust Bowl and then during the Second World War, and there was 150,000 people without homes in LA at the end of the war, and the government stepped in and built public housing and public-private sector housing, and they built these huge developments that are called garden apartments. I don't know if you have them in San Luis Obispo, but they're actually kind of pretty remarkable in those, at least those that have survived and been well loved and cared for. And what they are is, just to go back very quickly, they're kind of, again, using the courtyard model. They're sort of little mini courts, or housing around courts, and then they aggregate up to a super block scale, many blocks pieced together, and then the traffic is pushed to the edge. And the idea was that families, young families, working people would move in, and the kids would have a safe place to play, and the windows from the kitchen would look out onto the grass, and it was very much following a kind of progressive model that was coming out of Europe, actually, this idea that through modernism you could sort of create a better life for people. This is very much aimed at working and poor people. So the most famous in LA is called Village Green, and there it's something like 70% of land is left green, and so the ratio would simply be impossible today. But and this is really a parkland, so they call it Village Green. And then Park La Brea, if any of you is familiar with Park La Brea, jumped onto another one, Lincoln Place. And I mean, lovely, lovely, lovely places. And this is Lincoln Place, near where I live. And, you know, at times there'll be families having quinceañeras, you know, out there in the little area, because it's a huge development that is subdivided into these little manageable bite-sized pieces. So it's great. And then what I'm arguing is that this approach of the idea of the dwelling centered on some level of shared space still prevails today, albeit it doesn't look like a bungalow court. And you're finding a lot of it in the realm of affordable housing. And when I say affordable, I mean non-profit, mission-driven developer-built housing. I think you're getting some of that here, where the ROI isn't the driver. There's a different approach, and so they put much more emphasis on, I guess, sort of the quality of life, and that, some of the funders actually demand certain things, like you've got to have an amenity room, and you've got to have a courtyard, and you've got to have there's literally a funding stream that says you've got to have a barbecue on the roof. So anyway, some of the affordable housing that's being built, not necessarily, some of it's quite costly to build, and it's a bit of a paradox, and that's kind of part of the debate in LA. But what you're seeing is developers bringing in architects who are really trying to do sort of thoughtful remixes, as it were, of the old courtyard tradition, because a lot of these buildings, especially in the affordable sector, are on the thoroughfares. They're not in some nice bucolic low-rise neighborhood. They're on thoroughfares. There's 6 lanes of traffic running beside them. So how do they make these places livable? And this is just one that's on Martin Luther King Boulevard, aimed at people 30% of AMI, very poor. And there they have a sort of raised courtyard. So they come up the stairs and they have a raised courtyard. I showed you the Schindler Thanksgiving. This is their Thanksgiving about 3 years ago. And this is another one for veterans. This is Brooke Scarpa, who've done a lot of affordable housing, and they love the courtyard. They love Irving Gill, but they've discovered that for a variety of reasons, many of the residents don't want to sort of be around a courtyard that's on the ground level. There's a lot of trauma and PTSD and all sorts, so they've wanted to sort of elevate that courtyard, but still it becomes the central, the thing around which everything is oriented. So and then also in market rate, like I said, a lot of people, in a lot of these developments now, the so-called courtyard is kind of at the rooftop. This is really ultra market rate. This is in Beverly Hills, which Beverly Hills doesn't exactly welcome. Well, actually, before I say something I don't get correct, actually, Beverly Hills has a lot of apartments. It's just you wouldn't know it, because they don't, Beverly Hills 90210, that's not the story. Down and out in Beverly Hills might be the story, because that's where, again, the apartment is a stand-in for failure to achieve the American dream. But there's an architect who's coming from Beijing called Ma Yan Song, and he's building the new Lucas Museum in Exposition Park in LA. That's going to be a big splash. But meantime, he did a multifamily building in Beverly Hills as this central sort of donut inside. And he was very interesting. He took a look, a real outsider's eye. He took a look at how people lived in LA, and he's told me, he said, you know, I drove around Los Angeles, and I saw that what people want is they want a house in the Hollywood Hills, or house, yes, on the hills, and they want to have a secret garden. So what he did was he gave them the garden on the wall and the secret garden on the inside, and then he designed them in such a way that people would feel like they were living in a little house rather than conjoined dwellings. And then, believe me, there's a premium that people pay something like 15 grand a month to live in this. So the affordable I was showing you, very different, 500 a month, 700 a month. Super quickly, I'm sure you've got ADUs going up in San Luis Obispo. That's a whole other, a whole other pathway of development in LA. And ADUs is where a lot of designers and, mom and pop developers, homeowners are getting to be quite creative, actually, imaginative design-wise, but they're also thinking about and I've heard this from a lot of designers, they're thinking about what exactly is the relationship of us in the big house to the person or the people in the little houses. If it's grandma who's going to look after the kid during the day, do we want to have eye contact with grandma, or do we turn grandma so she's slightly facing away so we don't have to see each other all the time? And so anyway, I would argue that we're seeing a return to something akin, not the bungalow court exactly, it doesn't have that many units, but with the addition now, we started with ADUs, now we've got SB 9 and 10, you may be talking about SB 9 and 10 here, but if people do deliver on, is it time? Five. Okay, I'm doing quite well, I'm nearly done. So SB 9 and 10 actually is going to give property owners in LA the right to actually subdivide their lot now into, it could be 4 units, they can even lot split. So this actually really portends the revival of a kind of bungalow court. It's of course, and you all know more about this than I do, I'm sure, but it's really expensive to make pencil. It really is. And I know developers who are trying to reach the so-called missing middle. They're trying to reach these young families that need a place to live, who are not going to get the LA single family home. And it's really, really hard to make pencil. This is another of the ADUs, which I happen to really like, because this is in a historic neighborhood. You know, historic HPOZs, we have something like 43 HPOZs, historic preservation overlay zones in LA. And these homeowner associations have fought very hard to stop any kind of density coming into the neighborhoods, anything that changes the character. So anyway, they had to yield on the ADUs, and then Elizabeth Timmy, who designed this one, she had to work with the historic preservation with the HPOZ, and she ended up doing this because it's very craftsman in the area. And I have to say, I thought this was adorable. And then last thing, I haven't spent too much time on this, but I did mention that a lot of the housing is moving to the thoroughfares, and a good amount of that is mixed use. Jim's told me he's working on some mixed use where it's residential over shops, and you're exiting the building and there you are on a 6-lane thoroughfare. And really, what is that like to live on? And so I do think the interesting design challenge now is, how do you make life on a thoroughfare where, in a place like LA, where people have dreamed of the little lemon tree and the avocado tree in the backyard, and generous lawn out front. If that's not available anymore, how do you make something aspirational that's a completely different housing type? So anyway, this was actually one of the affordable housing buildings, and this is actually on Lincoln. If any of you knows LA, you will know that Lincoln is one of the ugliest streets in the world. And I live very close to Lincoln. I love Lincoln, but it is not a beauty. So anyway, this developer and the architects, really tried to make this, give some level of let the residents feel sequestered from Lincoln, because it's not pleasant, but also give a sort of visibility, a sort of porosity. And it's actually very nice, this building. This is affordable, very, very, very affordable. And then, we're seeing this kind of thing going up in LA now, very, very, very large. This is in West Hollywood, and what do you do as an architect to break down this massive behemoth? How do you give it visual vitality? And so that's also another challenge. And this actually has a big internal courtyard. The city of West Hollywood mandates courtyards. And here back, Brook Scarborough, I showed you them, they're right on Rose Avenue. Rose Avenue is kind of fairly rough, actually. And anyway, they have this is affordable, people paying about $500 a month to live in these units. They're like little micro units, and they have 2 levels of courtyards. And when you're up there, it's absolutely stunning. And then on the ground level, it's offices, actually for the company, Venice Community Housing. But people are just trying to come up with different ways to sort of model a way of living that can be quite alluring. And obviously it's subjective, people have different opinions. I know people that hate this sort of thing and think it looks like a prison, but it's pretty impressive when you see it. So anyway, like I say, challenge today, create a sense of seclusion, respite for the residents while engaging with and giving back to the street. And I just want to say that having grown up in the UK, where I lived, like many, many people, in row houses. You know, you all know row houses. And basically in in England, or brownstones in New York, you know, wherever, what do? You're in your flat, your apartment, and then you step out the front door, and there you are on the street. You just go from the house straight into the street, or vice versa. And then I got to LA, and I discovered these secret courtyards, and I just thought, these are so wonderful. So you're on the street, and then you've got this sort of secondary street, which is the alley or this garden, and you know you can't go in there, but you can sort of enjoy looking at it. And I love these places. So I showed you earlier spicy watermelon, people call it, spicy watermelon for its colour, and then inside it's like these little streets. I could spend a whole slideshow on just spicy watermelon, but it's so adorable. And then this is a building in West Hollywood designed by a pretty leading architect, Lorcan O'Hurley, and he made a point of giving to the street. He created these seating areas for people who are not living in the building. And then you go in, and there's the little secret, there's the courtyard. It's a very different architectural style, but it's the same thing, creating this sort of semi-private, open room. It's wonderful. And then this building, this is affordable, bless you. This is affordable. It's just gone up in South LA, and there it is. You look at it there and you think, you know, that looks a bit kind of like bulky and large. And then they've got the courtyard as well inside, very much referencing the sort of Spanish tradition. And then lastly, this is me. If any of you is the same generation as me, you may remember a very famous show that was about gorgeous 20-somethings that lived in a Spanish-style court. Can anybody remember? Melrose Place. Yeah. Melrose Place. So when I was working on the book and I would describe to people what the book was about, they'd say, it sounds a bit like Melrose Place. And I would say, you know, it is Melrose Place, except not just for beautiful 20-somethings. It's Melrose Place for lifers like me. And then this here is my friend Art Gray, who's a photographer. He took a lot of the photographs in the book. Art absolutely loved Melrose Place, so much so that he knew exactly where one of the sets for Melrose Place was. So we are standing in front of El Pueblo, which actually used to be used as the opening slide for Melrose Place. And with that, I conclude my talk.